They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when your own family treats you like you're drowning while you're actually swimming in success? My name is Maya Rodriguez, and this is the story of how one innocent question about a yellow Lamborghini changed everything at my sister's rehearsal dinner. For 3 years, my family watched me struggle with pity in their eyes, offering grocery store gift cards and job leads while I was quietly building an empire they couldn't even imagine. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let people underestimate you, especially when those people are supposed to love you unconditionally. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the youngest of 3 daughters in a tight-knit Mexican-American family in Phoenix, I learned early that success had a very specific definition in the Rodriguez household. It meant a steady job with benefits, a husband by 30, and enough stability to never worry your parents. My oldest sister Carmen became a nurse, married her high school sweetheart, and produced 2 beautiful grandchildren right on schedule. My middle sister Emma climbed the corporate ladder at the regional hospital, landed a handsome architect from Denver, and was planning the kind of wedding that would be talked about for years. Then there was me, Maya, the baby who seemed determined to color outside every line they'd ever drawn. I was the daughter who chose English literature over business administration, who moved out at 24 instead of staying home until marriage, who talked about writing and creativity while everyone else discussed retirement plans and mortgage rates. At family barbecues, I was the one sitting slightly apart, listening to conversations about promotions and property taxes while scribbling story ideas in a notebook I carried everywhere. They loved me, I never doubted that, but love came wrapped in constant worry and gentle disappointment that I couldn't seem to figure out how to be practical. My parents, Maria and Roberto Rodriguez, had built their American dream from nothing. Dad started as a construction worker and eventually owned his own contracting business. Mom cleaned houses until she could afford to go back to school and become a medical assistant. They understood sacrifice, hard work, and the security that comes from a predictable paycheck. What they didn't understand was why their youngest daughter seemed allergic to anything that resembled traditional success. Every family gathering included the same ritual of concerned questions disguised as casual conversation. How's the writing going? Any steady clients yet? Have you thought about maybe getting something more reliable? The subtext was always clear: we're worried about you, and we don't understand why you're making life so hard for yourself. By the time I turned 26, I had become the family project. Aunts would mention job openings at their workplaces. Cousins would offer to put in good words with their managers. Uncle Carlos, who'd done well in real estate, would corner me at parties with speeches about the importance of building wealth while you're young. They meant well, but their help felt like a constant reminder that they saw me as someone who needed saving. The harder I tried to explain what I was actually doing, the more their eyes would glaze over with polite confusion. Freelance writing wasn't a career in their world, it was something you did while looking for a real job. What made everything worse was that for the first 2 years after college, they were kind of right. I was struggling. My tiny studio apartment in Tempe was furnished with secondhand everything, and my diet consisted mainly of whatever was on sale at the discount grocery store. I'd take any writing gig I could find: blog posts for local businesses, social media content for startups, even product descriptions for online retailers. Most clients wanted to pay pennies for work that took hours, and I spent more time chasing invoices than actually writing. There were nights I'd lie awake calculating whether I could afford both electricity and groceries, wondering if maybe my family was right about needing something more stable. But something kept me going, some stubborn voice in my head that insisted I was meant for more than a cubicle and a corporate handbook. I started studying successful writers online, devouring everything I could find about copywriting and direct response marketing. I learned that some writers made 6 figures crafting email campaigns and sales pages, that the right words could literally generate millions in revenue for companies. It sounded too good to be true, but I was desperate enough to try anything. I spent my nights learning about psychology, persuasion, and the art of writing copy that moved people to action. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A small fitness company in Austin was looking for someone to write their email sequences, and they were willing to pay $3,000 for a month's worth of content. It was more money than I'd ever made from a single client, but they chose me based on a sample I'd written about overcoming personal obstacles. I poured everything I had into that project, researching their audience, studying their competitors, and crafting emails that felt personal and motivating. The results were immediate and dramatic. Their email open rates doubled, their sales tripled, and suddenly they were asking if I could handle their entire marketing campaign. Word started spreading in ways I hadn't expected. The fitness company mentioned my work to other entrepreneurs in their network. A software startup reached out after seeing the results I generated. Then a financial planning company hired me to write their product launch sequence. Each project was bigger than the last, and each success led to referrals I couldn't have imagined when I was writing blog posts for $50 each. Within 6 months, I was booking clients 3 months in advance and charging more for a single project than most people made in half a year. But here's the thing about sudden success when no one's watching: you start to realize how little you need other people to validate your achievements. My family still saw the same Maya, still asked the same worried questions, still offered the same helpful suggestions about finding something stable. I'd try to share my excitement about landing a major client or achieving incredible results, but their responses always felt like polite encouragement for a hobby rather than recognition of a thriving business. After a while, it became easier to just smile and nod when they asked about work, letting them assume I was still struggling while my bank account told a completely different story. The gap between their perception and my reality kept widening. They saw me driving my 8-year-old Honda Civic and assumed I couldn't afford anything better. They noticed I still shopped at thrift stores and thought it was out of necessity rather than choice. When I declined expensive family dinners or vacations, they'd exchange those knowing looks that said, "Poor Maya can't afford it again." The truth was I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed of, but I'd also learned to love the simplicity of living below my means. Why did I need designer clothes when my Target finds made me happy? Why upgrade my car when the Honda was reliable and paid off? My lifestyle choices weren't about limitation, they were about freedom. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was becoming financially successful by understanding human psychology and persuasion, yet I couldn't persuade my own family to see me differently. Maybe I didn't want to anymore. There was something peaceful about being underestimated, something liberating about success that didn't require external validation. My clients valued my work because they could measure the results in concrete numbers. Their businesses grew, their revenues increased, their email lists expanded, and their sales funneled in ways that could be tracked and verified. That felt more real than family approval ever had. As my income grew, so did my confidence in ways that had nothing to do with money. I was working with CEOs and entrepreneurs who respected my expertise and sought my advice on major business decisions. I was being invited to speak at marketing conferences and contributing to industry publications. Other copywriters were studying my campaigns and asking me to mentor them. I had built something meaningful and valuable, something that existed entirely separate from my family's understanding or approval. For the first time in my life, I felt truly successful, not because someone else told me I was, but because I had evidence of my impact on the world. The decision to buy the Lamborghini wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I'd just received a payment for a project that had generated over $2 million in sales for a client in less than 2 weeks. I was driving past the dealership on my way home from a coffee meeting, and something made me pull into the lot. The yellow Huracan was sitting in the showroom like a piece of art, and when the salesperson started talking about financing options, I quietly mentioned I'd prefer to pay cash. The look on his face was worth every hour I'd spent learning the craft that made that moment possible. I kept the car garaged most of the time, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need to drive it every day to remember what it represented. It was proof that I had arrived somewhere my family couldn't have imagined, somewhere I'd gotten by trusting my instincts and refusing to settle for their definition of success. Some nights I'd sit in the driver's seat without starting the engine, just running my hands over the steering wheel and remembering all the times I'd been told to be more practical, more realistic, more like everyone else. The yellow Lamborghini became my secret symbol of everything I'd accomplished while they worried about my future. Every family gathering where someone made a comment about my modest lifestyle, I'd think about that car waiting in my garage and smile genuinely for the first time all evening. They thought they were seeing the whole picture, but they were only seeing the tiny corner I chose to show them. The real Maya was building something extraordinary in the spaces between their assumptions, in the quiet hours after family dinners when I'd go home and create campaigns that would change businesses forever. I wasn't angry with them for not understanding. How could they comprehend a world where words on a screen could generate more revenue than years of traditional work? How could they imagine that their struggling writer-daughter was living a life that exceeded their wildest dreams of financial freedom? They were viewing my success through a lens that couldn't focus on anything they hadn't experienced themselves. But I'd learned that some victories are worth keeping private, some achievements are more powerful when they don't need to be explained or defended or justified to people who lack the context to appreciate them. This is the story of what happened when those two worlds collided on a hot Saturday evening in Scottsdale, when my sister's fiancé asked one innocent question that would force everyone to reckon with the woman I'd become while they were busy worrying about the woman they thought I still was. The invitation came on a cream-colored card with gold-embossed lettering, the kind of formal announcement that screamed expensive taste and careful planning. Emma had always been meticulous about these things, and her rehearsal dinner was going to be no exception. The venue was my parents' sprawling desert home in Scottsdale, a property they'd saved for decades to afford, with its red tile roof, adobe walls, and backyard that stretched toward the mountains like something out of a luxury magazine. Emma had transformed the space into what she called a desert romance theme, complete with strings of warm white lights wrapped around every saguaro cactus, long wooden tables dressed in flowing cream linens, and enough succulents to start a botanical garden. The guest list read like a roster of everyone who'd ever had an opinion about my life choices. There was Aunt Rosa, who never missed an opportunity to ask when I was planning to give my parents grandchildren. Uncle Miguel, who owned 3 auto repair shops and loved to lecture about the importance of building generational wealth. Cousin Gabriella, who worked as a paralegal and considered herself the family expert on career advancement. The neighbors, who'd watched us grow up, family friends who remembered when Emma and I used to put on backyard talent shows, and distant relatives who flew in from California and New Mexico because Emma's wedding was the social event of the year. As I sat in my modest apartment the night before the dinner, trying to decide what to wear, I realized I'd been attending these family gatherings for 3 years with an invisible shield of indifference. They would smile and ask their predictable questions, I would give my practiced answers, and we would all pretend that their concern wasn't really judgment dressed up as love. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My closet was full of designer pieces I'd bought with my copywriting income, but I reached past them for a simple black dress from Target, the kind of outfit that would confirm everything they already believed about my financial situation. There was something almost theatrical about it now, this performance of being the struggling artist daughter they needed me to be. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days crafting messages that moved people to action, understanding human psychology, at levels that allowed me to generate millions in sales for my clients. Yet I couldn't bridge the communication gap with my own family. Or maybe I'd simply stopped wanting to. There's a strange freedom that comes with being consistently underestimated. People tell you their real thoughts, they don't guard their words around you, and they certainly don't see you as competition for anything they want. In boardrooms and client calls, I was Maya Rodriguez, the copywriter who could transform a struggling business into a profit machine. At family gatherings, I was just Maya, the dreamy youngest daughter who still hadn't figured out how to be practical. I arrived at my parents' house just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink that made the whole backyard look like a painting. The mariachi band was already setting up near the pool, their instruments gleaming in the golden light. Servers in black uniforms moved efficiently between the kitchen and the outdoor bar, carrying trays of appetizers and adjusting place settings with military precision. Emma had hired a wedding planner who specialized in luxury events, and it showed in every carefully curated detail. My mother greeted me at the kitchen door, her face lighting up with that particular mixture of joy and worry that I'd learned to recognize as her default expression when it came to me. She was wearing a beautiful navy dress that Emma had helped her pick out, and her silver hair was styled in elegant waves that made her look years younger. "Mija, you made it," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like her favorite perfume. And the mole she'd been cooking all afternoon. "Emma was worried you might have to work tonight." The way she said work carried just enough hesitation to remind me that she still wasn't entirely sure what I did for a living, just that it involved computers and seemed to keep me busy at odd hours. Dad appeared from the living room, adjusting his tie with the uncomfortable expression of a man who'd rather be in work boots than dress shoes. Roberto Rodriguez had hands that told the story of 30 years in construction, weathered and strong from building other people's dreams before he'd saved enough to build his own. He'd worn a suit exactly 4 times in the past decade: Emma's college graduation, Carmen's wedding, his brother's funeral, and now this rehearsal dinner. "There's my writer," he said, kissing my forehead with the kind of paternal affection that never wavered, even when he didn't understand my choices. "Your sister's been running around all day making sure everything's perfect. You know how she gets." I did know how Emma got. My middle sister had inherited our mother's attention to detail and our father's determination to exceed expectations. She'd been planning this wedding for 18 months, creating color-coded spreadsheets and Pinterest boards that looked like professional mood boards. Her engagement to David had been the culmination of a 5-year relationship that progressed exactly as she'd mapped it out, meeting through mutual friends at 27, moving in together after 2 years, getting engaged on their 4th anniversary in a manner that she'd subtly orchestrated by leaving brochures for ring designers where he couldn't miss them. Emma appeared in the doorway like she'd sensed us. Talking about her, stunning in a silk wrap dress the color of champagne that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her dark hair was swept into an intricate updo that had required a trial run with her hairstylist, and she was wearing the diamond earrings that David had given her for Christmas, the ones she'd been not so subtly admiring in jewelry store windows. For months. "Maya," she exclaimed, though her smile faltered slightly when she took in my outfit. "You look." She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound insulting. "Comfortable." That one word carried the weight of everything. She didn't say. Emma had always been beautiful in the conventional way that opened doors and attracted attention. She was the daughter who'd been homecoming princess, who'd graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State, who'd landed her dream job in hospital administration and worked her way up to assistant director before she turned 30. Her life had unfolded like a carefully orchestrated plan, each milestone achieved on schedule, each success building naturally toward the next. My achievements were invisible to her because they didn't fit the template she understood. "Thanks," I replied, choosing not to mention that the comfortable dress had cost me $15 and that I could have afforded to buy every outfit in the boutique where she'd purchased her rehearsal dinner dress. "Everything looks incredible, Em. You've really outdone yourself." And she had. The backyard had been transformed into something magical, with cafe lights creating a canopy of stars overhead and arrangements of desert flowers that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. Uncle Miguel spotted me from across the patio and headed over with the purposeful stride of a man who'd been waiting all evening to share his latest insights about my career. He was Dad's older brother, the one who'd figured out how to turn his mechanical skills into multiple businesses and now drove a different luxury car every year. "Maya," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder with enough force to make me stumble. "Slightly. Still doing the writing thing, I see. You know, my buddy Carlos just opened a new insurance office, and he's looking for someone to help with his marketing. Real steady work, good benefits." I could put in a word. This was the ritual. At every family gathering, Uncle Miguel would have a new job opportunity that would save me from my impractical career choice. Last time it was a receptionist position at a dental office. Before that, an administrative assistant role at a law firm. He meant well, genuinely believed he was helping, but his suggestions always felt like gentle reminders that my family saw my work as a temporary inconvenience rather than a legitimate profession. "That's really thoughtful of you, Uncle Miguel," I said, maintaining the diplomatic smile I'd perfected over years of similar conversations. "I'm actually pretty busy with my current clients right now, but I appreciate you thinking of me." He nodded in the way people do when they think you're making a mistake but are too polite to argue, then launched into a detailed explanation of why insurance was a recession-proof industry and how I could really build something stable if I applied myself properly. Cousin Gabriella joined us halfway through Miguel's lecture, wine glass in hand and that particular gleam in her eye that meant she was ready to share unsolicited life advice. Gabriella had always positioned herself as the family success story. Among our generation, the one who'd made smart choices and could therefore speak with authority about everyone else's decisions. She worked at a prestigious law firm in downtown Phoenix, drove a BMW that she'd financed over 7 years, and lived in a downtown condo that she loved to mention cost more than our parents' first house. "Maya, I was just telling my friend Jessica about you," Gabriella said, taking a sip of wine that probably cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a week. "She works in marketing at a tech company, and they're always looking for writers. Real corporate stuff, good salary, amazing benefits. I could introduce you if you're interested in something more stable." The word "stable" was always the cornerstone of Gabriella's career advice, as if the freelance income that had allowed me to buy a supercar was somehow less reliable than her salary that disappeared the moment she stopped showing up to an office. I thanked her for the offer and deflected with questions about her own work, a conversational strategy that had served me well over the years. People love talking about themselves, and I'd learned that showing interest in their achievements was often enough to shift attention away from my own situation. Gabriella launched into a detailed account of a case she was working on, something involving commercial real estate that she clearly found fascinating and important. I nodded at appropriate intervals while mentally calculating that the commission from my last project would cover her annual salary twice over. The dinner bell chimed, a melodic sound that Emma had probably spent weeks choosing, and everyone began moving toward the long tables that had been arranged to accommodate 40 guests. I found my assigned seat, noting that I'd been placed between Aunt Rosa and family friend Patricia Morales, both women who considered themselves experts on how unmarried women in their late 20s should be conducting their lives. The seating chart wasn't accidental. Emma had probably spent hours arranging people in combinations that would generate the most comfortable conversations for her and David while ensuring that potentially awkward family dynamics were managed appropriately. As plates of perfectly prepared Mexican fusion cuisine appeared before us, the conversation settled into familiar patterns. Carmen, my oldest sister, regaled the table with stories about her twins' latest accomplishments in elementary school. David shared charming anecdotes about growing up in Colorado and learning to ski before he could properly ride a bike. Emma glowed at the head of the table, orchestrating the evening like the conductor of a well-rehearsed orchestra. And I sat quietly, participating just enough to avoid seeming antisocial while observing the social dynamics that I'd been studying for years without really understanding. The questions started during the second course, gentle probes disguised as family interest. "How's the writing going, Mija?" from Aunt Rosa. "Are you working on anything exciting?" from Patricia. "Still doing the freelance thing?" from cousin Diego, who'd driven down from Flagstaff for the weekend. Each question was asked with genuine affection, but underneath I could hear the subtext: when are you going to get a real job? When are you going to settle down? When are you going to start living like a responsible adult? I gave my standard responses, vague enough to avoid lengthy explanations but detailed enough to sound like I was sharing meaningful information. Yes, business was good. Yes, I was staying busy. Yes, I was working with some interesting companies. No, I wasn't dating anyone seriously right now. No, I wasn't planning to move back to Phoenix anytime soon. The conversation would inevitably drift to safer topics like the weather or upcoming family birthdays, leaving behind the faint impression that Maya was still figuring things out but seemed happy enough in her uncertain situation. What none of them knew was that earlier that week, I'd signed a contract for a project that would pay me more than most of them would earn in 2 years. A Fortune 500 company had hired me to write the launch sequence for a product that they projected would generate $50 million in first-year sales. The CEO had personally called to thank me for the proposal I'd submitted, saying it was the most compelling marketing strategy they'd seen in decades. The advance payment alone was enough to buy 3 more Lamborghinis, but I sat at that beautifully appointed table letting my family worry about my financial stability while I mentally planned how to invest the windfall. The disconnect was surreal. Here I was, surrounded by people who loved me, eating food that cost more per plate than I used to spend on groceries in a week, listening to conversations about mortgages and retirement planning while knowing that I'd already achieved financial independence beyond anything they were discussing. Part of me wanted to stand up and explain everything, to show them the bank statements and client testimonials and industry recognition that proved I'd built something remarkable. But a larger part of me had grown comfortable with the invisibility, with the freedom that came from success that didn't require their understanding or approval. Aunt Rosa leaned over during dessert service, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper she used for sharing family concerns. "Mija, I've been thinking about you," she said, patting my hand with the kind of maternal affection that came from helping raise all of us kids when our parents were working multiple jobs. "You know, my friend Carmen's daughter just got married, and she met her husband through one of those dating apps. Maybe it's time you started putting yourself out there more seriously. A smart, pretty girl like you shouldn't be alone." This was another familiar refrain, the gentle pressure to conform to a timeline that had been predetermined by generations of women who'd married young and built their identities around family structures. Rosa meant well, genuinely worried that I was missing out on happiness by prioritizing career over relationship, but she couldn't understand that I'd found fulfillment in ways that didn't require a wedding ring or joint tax returns. I was living exactly the life I wanted, with complete freedom to travel when inspiration struck, to work with clients who challenged and excited me, to build something meaningful without having to negotiate every decision with another person. "I appreciate you thinking about me, Tia," I said, using the affectionate term that had always made her light up with pleasure. "I'm really happy with how things are right now. If the right person comes along, that's great, but I'm not looking to change my life just to fit someone else's expectations." She nodded with the patient expression of someone who thought I was being naive but loved me too much to argue about it directly. The evening was winding down when David's phone buzzed with what looked like an urgent message. He glanced at it, then looked up with an expression of mild confusion that would change everything. "Sorry, work stuff," he said, though something in his tone suggested it wasn't entirely professional. He set the phone down and looked directly at me with the kind of focused attention that made me suddenly nervous. "Maya," he said, his voice carrying across the table in a way that made several conversations pause. "I hope this isn't too weird, but I have to ask you something." The silence that followed David's words felt like it stretched across the entire desert. Every fork stopped moving, every conversation died mid-sentence, and I could feel 40 pairs of eyes shifting between David and me like spectators at a tennis match waiting for the next serve. Emma's face had gone from glowing bride-to-be to concerned sister in the span of a heartbeat, and I could practically see her mentally rehearsing damage control strategies in case her future husband was about to embarrass the family's charity case. I was at the Scottsdale Quarter last Tuesday, David continued, his voice steady but curious, like an architect trying to solve a structural puzzle that didn't quite add up. I was meeting a client at that new restaurant near the Apple store, and when I came out, I saw this incredible yellow Lamborghini Huracan in the parking garage. Absolutely stunning car, probably worth more than most people's houses. But here's the thing that's been bugging me all week. I could have sworn I saw you getting into it. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, visible and impossible to ignore. I felt my mother's sharp intake of breath to my left, heard my father's wine glass touch the table with unnecessary force, watched Emma's carefully applied makeup seem to pale as she processed what her fiancé had just suggested. Uncle Miguel's mouth had actually fallen open, revealing a piece of the flan he'd been enjoying moments before. Cousin Gabriella looked like someone had just told her that gravity was optional. I took a slow sip of my water, buying myself a moment to decide how to respond while internally marveling at how one innocent observation could detonate a family gathering like a carefully placed explosive. For 3 years, I'd been protecting them from the truth of my success, letting them maintain their comfortable narrative about poor Maya who couldn't quite get her life together. Now David, the outsider who didn't understand the delicate ecosystem of assumptions and gentle condescension that had been carefully cultivated around my perceived failures, had accidentally kicked over the entire anthill. "Yeah," I said simply, setting my water glass down with the same calm precision I used when closing million-dollar deals with nervous CEOs. "That was me." The explosion was immediate and multifaceted. Emma let out a sound that was half laugh, half choke, like someone had told her a joke in a language she didn't understand. My mother's hand flew to her chest in the dramatic gesture she'd perfected during 30 years of worrying about her daughters. Dad just stared at me with the expression of a man trying to rebuild everything he thought he knew about the world. Uncle Miguel's eyes went so wide I thought they might actually fall out of his head. "Maya," Emma said, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic she used when one of her carefully orchestrated plans went off script. "That's not funny, David, she's just kidding around." She turned to me with a smile that looked like it had been painted on by someone who'd never seen an actual smile before. "Right? You're just messing with him because he's new to the family." But David wasn't backing down. His architect's mind was working through the problem like he was checking load-bearing calculations, and something in my expression had apparently confirmed his suspicions rather than dismissed them. "No, I don't think she's kidding," he said slowly, looking directly at me with the kind of professional assessment that had probably served him well in business negotiations. "Maya, that was a 2023 Huracan EVO, right? Giallo Bellini's paint job?" I only noticed because my firm is designing a house for a guy who collects supercars, and he's been trying to get that exact model for months. The level of specific detail in his question made denial impossible, even if I'd wanted to lie. David clearly knew enough about exotic cars to spot a fabrication from across the table, and something in his tone suggested he was genuinely curious rather than trying to embarrass me. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention like a physical pressure, decades of family assumptions crumbling in real time as they tried to reconcile the Maya they thought they knew with the woman who apparently owned a car worth more than most people's annual salaries. "That's the one," I confirmed, maintaining the same conversational tone I might use to discuss the weather or weekend plans. "I picked it up about 6 months ago from the dealer in Scottsdale. They had to special order that color combination, but it was worth the wait." The gasping sound that emerged from Aunt Rosa suggested she might need medical attention. Carmen, my oldest sister, was staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly an astronaut or a member of the royal family. Cousin Diego had his phone out and was clearly Googling Lamborghini prices under the table, his face growing progressively more incredulous as the search results loaded. The family friends and neighbors who'd known me since childhood looked like they were witnessing a magic trick they couldn't quite figure out. Emma's carefully constructed composure finally cracked completely. "Maya, what are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising above the polite dinner conversation level for the first time all evening. "You drive a Honda Civic. You shop at Target. You live in that tiny apartment in Tempe. You can't afford a Lamborghini. That's impossible." The word impossible hung between us like a challenge, carrying all the assumptions and limitations that my family had constructed around my life over the past 3 years. In Emma's world, success followed predictable patterns: college degree, corporate job, steady advancement, mortgage, marriage, children. The idea that her younger sister had somehow bypassed all those traditional markers and achieved the kind of financial success that allowed for supercar purchases didn't compute with her understanding of how the world worked. "I can afford a lot of things," I said quietly, meeting her disbelieving stare with steady confidence. "I just choose not to spend money on most of them." The Lamborghini was different. It was a celebration purchase after landing a particularly significant client. David leaned forward with genuine professional interest, apparently oblivious to the family drama he'd unleashed. What kind of work do you do, Maya? I mean, I know you're a writer, but that must be some seriously high-level writing to afford. That kind of car. This was the moment I'd been avoiding for 3 years, the conversation that would require me to explain my actual career to people who'd convinced themselves I was barely scraping by. The irony was almost funny. I'd spent years learning how to communicate complex ideas in ways that motivated people to take action, but I'd never figured out how to explain my own success to my family in terms they could understand and accept. I'm a direct response copywriter, I said, knowing the blank looks this would generate. I write marketing campaigns for businesses, specifically the kind of copy that's designed to generate immediate sales. Email sequences, sales pages, product launches, that sort of thing. Companies hire me when they want to increase revenue quickly and dramatically. Uncle Miguel, who prided himself on understanding business concepts, jumped in with the kind of confidence that suggested he thought he'd figured out the misunderstanding. Okay, but Maya, even if you're doing well with freelance writing, a Lamborghini costs what, $50,000? $60,000? That's a house down payment, Mija. Maybe you should be thinking about investing that money more wisely. The fact that his estimate was off by about $200,000 told me everything I needed to know about how far outside their frame of reference my actual lifestyle had become. I could see him doing calculations in his head, probably trying to figure out how many blog posts or newsletter articles someone would need to write to afford what he imagined was an expensive but still reasonable car purchase. Uncle Miguel, I said gently, a new Huracan EVO starts at around $300,000. Mine was closer to $350,000 with the options I wanted. And that was cash, not financed. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the mariachi band tuning their instruments by the pool, probably preparing for the evening's entertainment that would now feel somewhat anticlimactic after this particular revelation. Miguel's face went through several different expressions as he processed numbers that clearly didn't align with his understanding of freelance writing income. Gabriella had stopped pretending to check her phone and was staring at me with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was being reconstructed in real time. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard in years. Mija, how is that possible? I mean, where does that kind of money come from? We know what writers make, and it's not. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have revealed just how little they'd understood about my actual career trajectory. This was the conversation I'd been dreading and avoiding in equal measure. How do you explain to people who measure success in steady paychecks and annual raises that you've built a business where a single project can generate more income than they see in multiple years? How do you describe working with Fortune 500 companies and tech startups to family members who think freelance writing means crafting blog posts for small local businesses? Mom, the companies I work with aren't paying me to write articles or blog posts, I began, choosing my words carefully. They hire me to create marketing campaigns that directly generate revenue. When I write an email sequence that brings in $2 million in sales over a weekend, they're happy to pay me a percentage of that success. The value I provide isn't measured in words per hour, it's measured in dollars generated. David nodded with sudden understanding, his business background allowing him to grasp concepts that were clearly flying over most of the table's heads. That makes sense, he said, addressing the group as much as me. It's like hiring an architect for a major commercial project. You're not paying by the hour for someone to draw pictures, you're investing in expertise that will generate or save millions of dollars over time. The fee reflects the value created, not the time spent. I felt genuinely grateful for David's analogy, which translated my work into terms that at least some of my family could begin to understand. Architecture was a profession they respected, even if they didn't fully comprehend it, and the idea of paying significant fees for specialized expertise that generated large-scale results was something they could at least conceptually grasp. Emma, however, was still struggling with the fundamental disconnect between her perception of her sister and this new information. But Maya, if you've been making this kind of money, why didn't you tell us? Why are you still living like you're broke? Why do you drive that old Honda to family events? Why do you shop at discount stores? It doesn't make sense. The questions came rapid fire, each one loaded with years of assumptions and worry that were now being revealed as completely misplaced. I could hear the hurt underneath Emma's confusion, the realization that her younger sister had been allowing the family to worry about her financial situation while secretly living a lifestyle that exceeded anything they'd achieved. But there was also something else in her voice, a note of competitive concern, as if my hidden success somehow diminished her own carefully constructed achievements. Because this, I said, gesturing around the table at their shocked faces, is exactly What I wanted to avoid. I knew that telling you about my income would change everything between us, and not necessarily in good ways. I liked having relationships with all of you that weren't complicated by money or comparisons or expectations about how I should be living my life. The truth was more complex than that, but it was the most diplomatic explanation I could offer. Without getting into the years of gentle condescension and helpful suggestions that had taught me to keep my success private. I'd learned to love the freedom that came with being underestimated, the peace of relationships that weren't clouded by financial dynamics or competitive family politics. Cousin Gabriella, who'd built her entire identity around being the successful career woman among our generation, looked like she was processing a particularly challenging legal brief. Maya, I need to understand this better. What kind of companies are we talking about? And how long have you been making this kind of money? I could see her mental gears turning, trying to recalculate every family gathering where she'd offered me career advice or suggested I needed to get more serious about building wealth. The realization that I'd been sitting quietly while she lectured me about financial responsibility, all while outearning her by exponential margins, was clearly creating some cognitive dissonance. I've been working with tech startups, e-commerce companies, financial services firms, SaaS businesses, basically any company that needs to scale their customer acquisition quickly, I explained. The income has been building over the past 3 years, but the really significant numbers started about 18 months ago when I began working exclusively with larger companies and charging based on results rather than hourly rates. Uncle Miguel was still working through the mathematics, his expression suggesting he was having trouble accepting that his niece, who used to ask for help with her car payments, had somehow accumulated enough wealth to buy supercars with cash. But Maya, even if you're making good money now, $350,000 is a lot of money to spend on a car. Are you sure you're being smart about this? What about retirement? What about buying a house? His questions revealed another layer of the disconnect between their financial worldview and mine. They were thinking about money in terms of budgeting and saving and making careful choices between competing priorities. I was operating in a space where the Lamborghini purchase represented less than a month's income from a good project, where financial decisions were driven by desire rather than necessity, where traditional concepts like retirement planning had become somewhat academic because I'd already achieved financial independence. I appreciate the concern, Uncle Miguel, but I'm in a fortunate position where I can afford the car without it impacting any other financial goals, I said. I own my apartment outright, I have substantial savings and investments, and my business continues to grow every quarter. The Lamborghini was really just a way to celebrate reaching a milestone I'd set for myself. This answer seemed to stun him into silence, probably because it revealed that I wasn't just making good money, I was making enough money to purchase luxury items without financial stress, which suggested an income level that none of them had imagined possible for a freelance writer working from a modest apartment in Tempe. Carmen, who'd been quietly observing the conversation while managing her own shock, finally spoke up with the practical concern of an older sister who'd spent years worrying about my life choices. Maya, honey, this is wonderful, but I'm confused about why you've been letting us worry about you all this time. Do you know how many nights Mom has stayed awake concerned about whether you had enough money for groceries? How many times Dad has wanted to help but didn't know how to bring it up without hurting your pride? The guilt hit me immediately and unexpectedly, a sharp reminder that my decision to keep my success private had consequences beyond my own desire for peace and autonomy. I'd been so focused on avoiding the complications that would come with revealing my income that I hadn't fully considered the emotional cost of allowing my parents to carry unnecessary worry about my well-being. I never meant for you to worry, I said, looking directly at my parents, who were still processing everything with expressions of confusion mixed with relief. I thought it was easier to just let you think I was getting by okay rather than trying to explain something that I knew would be hard to understand. But you're right, that wasn't fair to you. My father cleared his throat, a sound that always preceded his most thoughtful observations. Roberto Rodriguez was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened because they knew he'd chosen each word carefully. Mija, he said slowly, I'm proud of you for building something successful. I don't understand it completely, but I can see that you've worked hard and achieved something important. What I don't understand is why you felt like you couldn't share this with your family. The question hung in the air with the weight of 3 years of family dynamics, gentle disappointments, and missed connections. How could I explain that their love had always come wrapped in expectations about how my life should unfold? How could I tell them that their concern for my future had often felt like judgment about my choices? How could I describe the freedom I'd found in success that didn't require their approval or understanding? Instead, I chose honesty over diplomacy. Because I was tired of defending my career choices and lifestyle decisions to people who'd already decided they knew what was best for me. I wanted to build something on my own terms without having to justify every step to family members who couldn't understand why I wasn't following a more traditional path. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, carrying years of frustration that I'd kept carefully buried beneath polite family interactions. I could see the impact on their faces, the realization that their daughter had felt judged and misunderstood, even as they thought they were offering support and guidance. The silence that followed was heavy with hurt feelings and recognition of communication failures on both sides. Emma was the first to break the quiet, her voice smaller and more vulnerable than I'd heard since we were teenagers. "Maya, I never meant to make you feel like you had to hide from us. I thought I was just being a supportive big sister, trying to help you figure things out." The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. Emma had always been the achiever, the daughter who met every expectation and exceeded every goal, and the idea that her success might have been used as an implicit measuring stick for my own choices was clearly something she'd never considered. "I know you meant well," I said, softening my tone because I could see genuine hurt in her eyes. "But when someone is building something unconventional, sometimes the most supportive thing you can do is trust them to know what they're doing, even when it doesn't look like the path you would choose." David, who'd been quietly observing the family dynamics he'd accidentally exposed, spoke up with the careful neutrality of someone trying to help without overstepping boundaries. "For what it's worth, Maya's approach makes a lot of sense from a business perspective. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs I know keep very low profiles until they're ready to go public with their achievements. It allows them to focus on building rather than managing other people's expectations or opinions." His validation felt unexpectedly meaningful, partly because it came from someone with no emotional investment in our family history, but also because it reframed my choices as strategic rather than secretive. I'd been protecting my space to grow and succeed without interference, not hiding shameful failures or deceptive behavior. The evening had taken a turn that none of us could have anticipated when we sat down for what was supposed to be a celebration of Emma and David's upcoming marriage. Instead, we'd stumbled into a conversation about success, family expectations, and the complex dynamics that develop when love gets tangled up with assumptions about how people should live their lives. As dessert plates were cleared and the mariachi band began setting up for their performance, I could feel the subtle shift in energy around the table. The revelation about the Lamborghini had cracked open years of carefully maintained family narratives, forcing everyone to reconsider not just their understanding of my life, but their assumptions about success, money, and what it meant to support someone you love. The night was far from over, but already I could sense that relationships would be different going forward. The question was whether different would ultimately mean better or just more complicated. The mariachi band struck their first chord just as the last of the dessert plates disappeared into the kitchen, their music floating across the desert air like a soundtrack to the most surreal family dinner of my life. The timing felt almost cinematic, as if someone had scripted this moment when everything I'd carefully hidden for 3 years would finally spill out across the cream-colored linens and force everyone to reckon with who I'd actually become while they were busy worrying about who they thought I was. My phone buzzed against my leg, probably another client message that would have to wait until tomorrow, but the irony wasn't lost on me that the device in my pocket connected me to a professional world where my expertise was valued and sought after, while I sat at this table surrounded by people who loved me but had never truly seen me. The disconnect had become so normal that I'd stopped noticing it most of the time, but tonight it felt as sharp and obvious as the desert mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. Emma was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something caught between admiration and bewilderment, like she was meeting her sister for the first time and trying to figure out how they'd lived in the same family for 28 years without really knowing each other. David had settled back in his chair with the satisfied look of someone who'd solved a puzzle that had been nagging at him, though I suspected he was beginning to realize that his innocent question had detonated something much larger than a simple case of mistaken identity. "Maya," my mother said finally, her voice carrying that particular blend of hurt and wonder that I remembered from childhood moments when I'd surprised her with something she hadn't expected, both good and bad. "I still don't understand why you felt like you couldn't tell us about your success. We're your family. We want to celebrate your achievements, not judge them." The statement hung in the desert air with all the weight of 3 years of misunderstood family dynamics, and I realized that this was the moment where I could either continue protecting everyone's feelings with diplomatic explanations, or I could offer the truth that might actually help us move forward in healthier ways. The choice felt heavier than it should have, loaded with years of careful navigation around hurt feelings and defensive reactions. "Mom, remember last Christmas when I mentioned that I'd had a really good year and might be able to help with Carmen's kids' college funds?" I asked, watching recognition dawn in her eyes. "You told me it was sweet that I wanted to help, but that I shouldn't worry about things like that until I had my own life more settled. When I tried to explain that I was actually in a position to contribute meaningfully, you patted my hand and said I was generous but should focus on building my own security first. The memory played across her face like a movie she was seeing for the first time, even though she'd lived through the original scene. I could see her recalibrating that conversation, understanding now that what she'd interpreted as naive generosity from a struggling daughter had actually been a genuine offer of financial assistance from someone who'd already achieved the security she was worried about. I stopped trying to share my professional wins because every time I did, they got filtered through your assumptions about my situation, I continued, keeping my voice gentle but direct. When I told you about landing a major client, you'd say, you were proud of me for staying positive. When I mentioned taking time off to travel, you'd worry about me being responsible with money. When I talked about my work, you'd ask if I was networking enough to find something more stable. The message I kept getting was that my choices didn't make sense to you, so eventually I stopped explaining them. Uncle Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, probably remembering all the job opportunities he'd presented to me with such earnest conviction that I needed saving from my impractical career path. Cousin Gabriella was staring at her wine glass, like it contained answers to questions she was just beginning to formulate. The family, friends and neighbors who'd known me since childhood were exchanging glances that suggested they were mentally revisiting every conversation they'd ever had about poor Maya, who couldn't quite get her act together. Carmen, my oldest sister, spoke up with the careful tone of someone trying to bridge a gap she was just beginning to see. Maya, I think what Mom means is that we love you and want to support you, but maybe we didn't know how to do that when your path looked so different from what we expected. When you're a parent, or an older sister, it's hard to watch someone you care about taking risks that you don't understand. Her words carried the wisdom of someone who'd navigated motherhood for over a decade, who understood the complexity of wanting to protect people you love while also respecting their autonomy to make their own choices. I could see in her expression that she was processing not just my revelation about financial success, but the broader implications of how family support sometimes masked family control, how love could accidentally become a limitation when it was based on fear rather than trust. I get that, I said, acknowledging the genuine care behind years of concern that had felt like judgment. But Carmen, you have to understand that from my perspective, it felt like you'd all decided what my life should look like and were trying to steer me toward that vision whether it fit me or not. I needed space to figure out who I was and what I was capable of without constantly defending my choices to people who'd already concluded they were mistakes. The truth settled over the table like desert dust, visible and impossible to ignore. We'd all been operating from incomplete information, making assumptions that protected our individual worldviews while creating distance that none of us had intended. They'd seen my unconventional choices as concerning because they didn't understand the strategy behind them. I'd interpreted their concern as lack of faith because I'd been too proud to explain the full scope of what I was building. David cleared his throat with the diplomatic timing of someone who'd spent years mediating between clients with different visions for the same project. If I can offer an outside perspective, he said, glancing around the table to make sure his input was welcome, this seems like one of those situations where everyone had good intentions but was working with different information. Maya was protecting her space to grow, and the family was trying to offer support based on what they could see. Neither approach was wrong, but they weren't compatible. His observation carried the neutrality of someone who hadn't been part of the years of accumulated miscommunication, and I felt grateful for his ability to frame our family dynamics as a problem to solve rather than a conflict to win. Architecture probably taught you to think that way, to see structural issues that could be addressed with better design rather than fundamental flaws that required demolition and rebuilding. Emma had been quietly processing everything, her carefully planned evening now completely overshadowed by revelations that had nothing to do with her engagement but everything to do with family relationships she thought she understood. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than usual, stripped of the confident authority she typically brought to family conversations. Maya, I'm trying to understand why you thought we wouldn't be proud of your success, she said, genuine confusion evident in her tone. I've always looked up to you for being brave enough to pursue creative work. If I sometimes seemed worried, it was because I wanted you to have the same kind of security and recognition that I knew you deserved. I never meant to make you feel like your choices were wrong. The admission revealed a layer of our relationship that I'd never fully recognized, the possibility that Emma's seemingly patronizing concern had actually stemmed from admiration for risks she'd never been brave enough to take herself. She'd followed every conventional milestone not just because they appealed to her, but because they felt safe in ways that my path never had. Her worry about my stability might have been partially motivated by her own fear of what would happen if she ever stepped outside the carefully constructed boundaries of traditional success. I know you meant well, I said, feeling the defensive walls I'd built around this topic beginning to crumble. But when someone keeps suggesting that you need a backup plan, it starts to feel like they don't believe your primary plan can work. When family conversations always include hints about getting serious about your future, it sends the message that what you're currently doing isn't serious enough. She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression like sunrise over the mountains. I never thought about it that way, she admitted. I guess I was so focused on wanting you to be okay that I didn't consider how my concern might sound like criticism. This was the conversation we'd needed to have years ago, the honest examination of how love and worry and family expectations could tangle together in ways that created distance instead of connection. We'd all been trying to protect each other from different perceived threats, creating a dynamic where genuine care got expressed as subtle pressure and authentic success got hidden to avoid uncomfortable conversations. My father had been listening to this exchange with the concentrated attention he brought to complex construction problems, situations where multiple systems had to work together perfectly or the whole structure would fail. When he spoke, his words carried the deliberate weight of someone who'd been thinking carefully about structural integrity, both architectural and familial. Maya, I want you to know that your mother and I are proud of what you've built, he said, his voice steady but emotional. We may not understand the details of your work, but we can see that you've created something valuable and meaningful. What concerns me is that you felt like you had to do it alone, without letting us support you along the way. The statement hit me harder than I'd expected, carrying decades of his own experience building something from nothing while feeling like he had to prove himself worthy of respect and recognition. Roberto Rodriguez had spent his career being underestimated by people who saw a Mexican immigrant with rough hands rather than a skilled craftsman with vision and intelligence. He understood what it felt like to succeed in spite of other people's limitations, not because of their support. Dad, I didn't feel like I had to do it alone, I said, realizing as I spoke that this wasn't entirely true. I felt like I had to prove it was working before I could share it with you, because I knew that if it failed, everyone would point to it as evidence that I should have chosen something more practical from the beginning. The admission revealed a level of pressure I'd put on myself that went beyond family dynamics, the weight of representing not just my own career choices but the validity of anyone who chose unconventional paths over traditional security. I'd felt like I was carrying the burden of proving that creative and entrepreneurial approaches to building wealth were legitimate alternatives to corporate careers and steady paychecks. Aunt Rosa, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet during most of this conversation, finally spoke up with the kind of direct honesty that came from decades of watching family members dance around difficult truths. Mija, we all made mistakes here, she said, her voice carrying the authority of the family matriarch who'd helped raise most of us. You were wrong to hide your success from people who love you, and we were wrong to assume we knew what was best for your life without really listening to what you were trying to build. Her assessment was both accurate and liberating, acknowledging that this situation didn't require anyone to be completely right or wrong, just willing to do better going forward. Rosa had always been the family member who could cut through emotional complexity to identify practical solutions, the one who could mediate disputes between siblings or cousins by focusing on what needed to happen next rather than who had been hurt by what had happened before. You're absolutely right, Tia, I said, feeling genuinely grateful for her ability to frame this as a learning experience rather than a blame assignment. I should have trusted you all enough to share what was happening in my life, even when I wasn't sure you'd understand it. And maybe I should have been more patient in explaining it when questions came up. The mariachi band had moved into a slower song, something romantic and nostalgic that provided a soundtrack for this unexpected family reconciliation. The desert air was cooling as night settled around us, and the string lights that Emma had so carefully arranged cast everything in a warm glow that made even difficult conversations feel somehow manageable. David's phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at it with a slight smile that suggested the message was related to our earlier discussion. Actually, Maya, this is kind of funny timing, he said, holding up the screen so I could see. This is a message from my client who collects supercars. He says he finally tracked down the owner of that yellow Huracan and wants to know if she'd consider selling it to him. He's offering $400,000, which is apparently well above market value because he's been looking for that exact configuration for 2 years. The table erupted in surprised laughter, the kind of tension-breaking humor that felt like a gift after the emotional intensity of the past hour. The idea that my car had become the object of someone else's obsession while my family was still processing the fact that I owned it at all felt like the perfect absurd punctuation to this entire evening. Tell him thanks, but I'm not ready to sell, I said, grinning at the cosmic timing of the offer. I'm still enjoying the reminder of what's possible when you trust yourself enough to pursue something that doesn't make sense to other people. The comment was directed at my family as much as David's client, a gentle way of reinforcing the larger lesson that had emerged from this conversation. Sometimes the most valuable things we build require faith in visions that other people can't see, patience with processes that don't follow familiar timelines, and courage to continue even when the people we love most are worried about our choices. Emma raised her wine glass with a smile that looked genuinely happy for the first time all evening. Her role as the family's success story suddenly expanded to include a sister whose achievements complemented rather than competed with her own. To Maya, she said, her voice carrying warmth and newfound respect, for building something amazing and for finally trusting us enough to share it. The toast was echoed around the table with enthusiasm that felt authentic rather than obligatory, family members lifting their glasses to celebrate not just my professional success but the possibility of more honest relationships going forward. As I sipped my water and watched the faces of people who'd known me my entire life but were just beginning to really see me, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with financial achievement and everything to do with finally being understood. The yellow Lamborghini was still parked in my garage 20 minutes away, a beautiful machine that represented years of strategic thinking and disciplined execution. But the real treasure was sitting around this table, flawed and complicated. People who loved me enough to examine their assumptions and adjust their understanding when presented with new information. That kind of flexibility and growth was rarer and more valuable than any supercar, even one that random collectors were willing to overpay for. As the evening wound down and family members began making departure plans, I realized that David's innocent question had accomplished something I'd been avoiding for 3 years. It had forced us all to confront the gap between perception and reality, to examine how our individual fears and expectations had shaped our interactions, and to consider how we might support each other more effectively going forward. The drive home in my Honda Civic felt different than usual, not because the car had changed but because the weight of maintaining a careful facade had been lifted. Tomorrow I could wake up and be authentically myself with my family for the first time in years, no longer protecting them from my success or protecting myself from their well-meaning concerns. The freedom was intoxicating in ways that had nothing to do with financial independence and everything to do with emotional authenticity. My phone buzzed with text messages as I pulled into my apartment complex, family members reaching out to continue conversations that had been cut short by the evening's end. Emma wanted to hear more about my business and understand how she might refer potential clients. Carmen was curious about the companies I worked with and whether any of them might need nursing consultants. Even Uncle Miguel had sent a message, asking if I'd be willing to help him improve the marketing for his auto shops. The shift from seeing me as someone who needed career guidance to someone who might provide it felt significant, a recognition that my expertise had value within our family network and not just in the broader professional world. It suggested that going forward, family gatherings might include conversations where my insights were sought rather than situations where my choices were questioned. As I sat in my car reviewing the messages and reflecting on the evening's revelations, I realized that the yellow Lamborghini in my garage had served its purpose before I'd even intended to buy it. It had become the undeniable proof that forced everyone to question their assumptions, the concrete evidence that my unconventional path had led somewhere worth reaching. Sometimes success needs a symbol that other people can understand and measure, even when the real achievement is much more complex and meaningful than any object could represent. The desert night was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the whispered conversations of neighbors returning from their own Saturday evening adventures. Tomorrow I would wake up in the same apartment, drive the same reliable car, to the same coffee shop where I did my best thinking, and continue building the same business that had already changed my life in ways that extended far beyond financial metrics. But everything would be different because the people who mattered most finally understood who I'd become while they weren't watching. The yellow Lamborghini would remain in my garage, a beautiful reminder of what was possible when you trusted your vision enough to pursue it regardless of other people's doubts. But the real victory was sitting in family text messages on my phone, relationships that had been transformed by honesty and were stronger for having survived the shock of truth. 3 weeks after Emma's rehearsal dinner, I found myself sitting in the boardroom of a Fortune 100 company in downtown Phoenix, presenting a marketing strategy that would potentially generate $50 million in first quarter revenue. The CEO, a woman who'd built her career breaking through glass ceilings in the tech industry, was asking detailed questions about customer psychology and conversion optimization while her team of VPs took notes on every word I said. 6 months ago, I would have driven to this meeting in my Honda Civic and kept the contract details private from my family. Today, I'd arrived in the yellow Lamborghini and planned to call my parents afterward to share the news. The shift wasn't just about transparency, it was about finally understanding that hiding my achievements had been protecting everyone from growth rather than preserving family harmony. The uncomfortable conversations that followed David's innocent question had forced us all to examine assumptions we'd been carrying for years. And what emerged was a family dynamic built on genuine understanding rather than careful avoidance of difficult topics. Emma had started asking substantive questions about my business strategies. Carmen was exploring ways her healthcare expertise might complement my marketing knowledge. Even Uncle Miguel had begun treating me as a resource rather than a project. The presentation went exactly as I'd hoped, with the CEO approving a six-figure contract that would establish my agency as their primary marketing partner for a product launch that could reshape their entire industry. As I walked back to the parking garage, briefcase in hand and signed contracts secured in my laptop bag, I realized that success felt completely different when you could share it with people who genuinely understood and celebrated your achievements. The isolation I'd maintained for 3 years had been self-imposed, based on assumptions about my family's reactions that had turned out to be incomplete and unfair. My phone rang as I reached the Lamborghini, Emma's name appearing on the screen. With perfect timing that had become a pattern since our family revelation. She'd started calling after my big meetings, not to offer unsolicited advice about financial responsibility, but to hear about the projects I was working on and understand the business I'd built while she wasn't watching. The role reversal still felt strange sometimes, shifting from the sister who needed guidance to the one who provided industry insights, but it was a comfortable strangeness that suggested growth rather than disruption. "How did it go with the tech company?" she asked immediately, skipping past pleasantries with the directness that had always characterized our relationship, even when it was focused on concern rather than celebration. "Did they approve the campaign you've been developing?" The genuine interest in her voice would have shocked me a month ago, but I'd begun to understand that Emma's previous worry about my career had been motivated by love rather than judgment, even when it felt limiting and frustrating. She'd spent years watching me take risks she couldn't comprehend, wanting me to succeed but not understanding how success was possible outside traditional frameworks that provided clear measures of progress and security. "Better than I hoped," I said, settling into the driver's seat and watching downtown Phoenix spread out below the parking garage like a map of possibilities. "They want to expand the project beyond what we originally discussed. It's going to be the biggest contract I've ever signed, and they're talking about making me their exclusive marketing partner for the next 3 years." The silence that followed wasn't the uncomfortable pause that used to characterize family reactions to my professional updates, filled with uncertainty about how enthusiastic they should sound about achievements they didn't understand. This was the silence of someone processing genuinely exciting news and formulating appropriate responses, the kind of reaction I'd been craving for years without realizing how much my own communication patterns had prevented it. "Maya, that's incredible," Emma said, her excitement sounding completely authentic for the first time I could remember. "I know I don't understand all the technical details of what you do, but I can hear in your voice how meaningful this is. Are you going to celebrate? You should celebrate. This sounds like the kind of milestone that deserves recognition." The suggestion that I should celebrate my achievements was such a departure from years of conversations focused on responsibility and practical considerations that I almost laughed. Emma had spent our entire adult relationship encouraging me to be more cautious, more traditional, more focused on building security rather than pursuing opportunities that seemed risky or unconventional. Now she was suggesting that I acknowledge and honor success that exceeded anything either of us had imagined possible when we were young women trying to figure out how to build meaningful careers. "I'm thinking about taking a weekend trip to San Diego," I said, testing how it felt to share vacation plans that weren't disguised as business trips or framed as necessary breaks from challenging work schedules. "There's this art gallery opening I've wanted to attend, and the hotel overlooks the ocean. It feels like the right way to mark this transition from freelancer to agency owner." 3 weeks ago, mentioning an expensive weekend trip would have triggered Emma's financial concern reflexes, gentle suggestions about saving money and being practical about discretionary spending. Today, she responded with enthusiasm that acknowledged both my business success and my right to enjoy the fruits of strategic thinking and disciplined execution. "That sounds perfect," she said. "You've earned the right to enjoy your success, Maya. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. I was so focused on wanting you to be safe that I didn't recognize you were building something that would make you safer than any traditional job ever could." The apology carried weight that went beyond our specific family dynamics, acknowledging broader cultural assumptions about security and success that had shaped both our understanding of what constituted responsible career choices. Emma had followed conventional wisdom about building wealth and stability, achieving impressive results within established frameworks that provided clear progression and measurable outcomes. I'd chosen to create my own framework, developing expertise in emerging fields and building systems that generated value in ways that traditional metrics couldn't easily capture. Both approaches had led to success, but only one had been recognized and celebrated by our family until David's accidental revelation forced everyone to expand their definitions of achievement and security. The conversation we were having represented years of missed connections finally being addressed, relationship patterns being consciously adjusted to accommodate broader understanding of how people could build meaningful careers and financial independence. You weren't wrong to worry, I said, wanting to acknowledge the genuine care behind years of concern that had felt like criticism. I was taking risks that didn't make sense from the outside, and I wasn't sharing enough information for you to understand the strategy behind my choices. I should have trusted you all enough to explain what I was building, even when I wasn't sure it would work. The admission felt liberating in ways I hadn't expected, acknowledging my own role in creating family dynamics that had felt limiting and unsupportive. I'd been so focused on protecting my space to experiment and grow that I'd isolated myself from people who might have offered valuable perspectives and emotional support during the challenging early phases of building my business. Fear of judgment had prevented me from accessing family wisdom that could have made the journey less lonely and more sustainable. Emma's response carried the relief of someone who'd been carrying guilt about family interactions she'd never fully understood. "I'm glad you're finally sharing this with us," she said. "I want to understand your world better, Maya. I want to be the kind of sister who celebrates your achievements rather than worrying about your choices." The commitment represented a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic, from Emma positioning herself as the responsible older sister offering guidance to the struggling younger sibling, to recognizing me as an equal partner in family success stories who deserved respect and celebration rather than concern and advice. The change required both of us to abandon comfortable roles that had defined our interactions for years, but it opened possibilities for authentic connection based on current reality rather than outdated assumptions. As I drove home through Phoenix traffic, I reflected on how dramatically my daily experience had changed since the revelation at Emma's rehearsal dinner. The business hadn't changed. I was still writing marketing campaigns for innovative companies and generating revenue that exceeded most people's annual salaries. My apartment was the same modest space I'd chosen for its simplicity and proximity to hiking trails. The Honda Civic was still my preferred vehicle for everyday errands and grocery shopping. What had transformed was the weight I carried around family relationships, the emotional energy I'd been expending to maintain careful facades and navigate conversations that required constant editing of my actual experience. Authenticity turned out to be exhausting when it required continuous performance, but liberating when it became the foundation for genuine connection with people who mattered most. My parents had been the most dramatically affected by the revelation, not because they'd been the most critical of my choices, but because they'd carried the heaviest burden of worry about my financial security and future prospects. Dad had spent years wanting to offer financial assistance but not knowing how to broach the subject without damaging my pride or independence. Mom had lost sleep over concerns about my ability to maintain health insurance and plan for retirement when my income seemed unpredictable and modest. Learning that their youngest daughter had not only achieved financial independence but had built wealth that exceeded their own retirement savings had required them to completely recalibrate their understanding of modern career paths and the possibilities available to people willing to develop expertise in emerging fields. The adjustment period had been challenging for all of us, but it had resulted in family relationships based on current reality rather than assumptions rooted in generational expectations about how success was supposed to unfold. The weekly family dinners that had resumed after Emma's wedding had become laboratories for practicing new communication patterns, opportunities to share professional developments and seek advice from family members whose perspectives I was finally ready to hear and consider. Uncle Miguel's business experience had provided valuable insights about scaling operations and managing cash flow. Carmen's healthcare background had helped me understand client industries I'd never fully grasped. Even Aunt Rosa's questions about work-life balance had prompted useful reflection about sustainable business practices and long-term goals. The yellow Lamborghini had become less important as a symbol once my family understood what it represented, but it remained meaningful as a reminder of what became possible when you trusted your vision enough to pursue it despite other people's doubts or concerns. I still drove it occasionally, especially to client meetings where arriving in a supercar reinforced my positioning as someone who generated exceptional results and commanded premium fees. But the emotional weight it had carried as proof of hidden success had been replaced by simpler appreciation for beautiful engineering and the freedom to make purchasing decisions based on desire rather than necessity. My business had continued expanding in ways that might not have been possible when I was operating in isolation, protected from family input but also cut off from family resources and connections. David's architectural firm had become a client after Emma mentioned my expertise in conversion optimization. Carmen's hospital had hired me to improve their patient communication materials. Uncle Miguel was planning to launch a digital marketing campaign for his auto shops based on strategies I developed for other service businesses. The family network that had once felt like a source of pressure and misunderstanding had evolved into a business ecosystem where different types of expertise could complement each other in mutually beneficial ways. Emma's corporate experience provided valuable insights about enterprise sales cycles. Dad's construction background offered perspective on project management and client relationship maintenance. Mom's medical administrative experience had helped me understand healthcare industry dynamics that proved crucial for several major contracts. The integration felt natural rather than forced, emerging from genuine appreciation for different skill sets and perspectives rather than obligatory family support that created more complexity than value. Everyone had expertise worth sharing, and everyone had gaps where other family members' knowledge could provide missing pieces for better decision-making and strategic thinking. 6 months after the rehearsal dinner revelation, I found myself preparing for the biggest presentation of my career, a proposal to become the exclusive marketing partner for a technology company whose products could revolutionize how small businesses manage their financial operations. The contract would guarantee 7 figures in annual revenue for my agency and establish me as a recognized expert in a rapidly growing field that most people were just beginning to understand. The preparation process had included input from family members whose perspectives had proven more valuable than I'd ever imagined possible. Emma's corporate experience had helped me structure the proposal in ways that would resonate with executive decision makers. Dad's entrepreneurial background had provided insights about the practical concerns that would influence purchasing decisions. Mom's administrative expertise had identified potential implementation challenges that I could address proactively in my recommendations. The collaboration felt revolutionary after years of operating as a solo practitioner who made all strategic decisions independently, but it also felt completely natural, like finally accessing resources that had always been available but had required different communication patterns to unlock. Family relationships improved when they were based on mutual respect for different types of expertise rather than assumptions about who needed guidance and who was qualified to provide it. The presentation was scheduled for the following week. And regardless of the outcome, I knew that the process of preparing for it had already generated value that extended beyond any single business opportunity. My family had evolved from a source of well-meaning concern that felt limiting to a strategic resource that enhanced my professional capabilities while providing emotional support that made challenging work more sustainable and enjoyable. Emma called as I was reviewing the final draft of my proposal, her timing as perfect as it had been since we'd started communicating more openly about professional developments and business challenges. The regular check-ins had become a highlight of my week, opportunities to process complex client dynamics with someone who understood corporate culture and could offer perspective on interpersonal strategies that might improve outcomes. "How are you feeling about next week's presentation?" she asked, her voice carrying the supportive confidence that had replaced years of cautious encouragement that felt more like worry than celebration. "Do you have everything you need, or is there anything I could help you think through?" The offer of assistance represented such a complete transformation from our previous dynamic that I sometimes had to remind myself that this was the same sister who'd spent years suggesting I needed more stable career options and practical backup plans. Emma had evolved from seeing my work as concerning hobby to recognizing it as legitimate expertise worthy of respect and intellectual curiosity. "I think I'm as ready as I'll ever be," I said, settling into my home office chair and looking at the wall where I'd started displaying industry awards and client testimonials that had previously lived in digital folders where no one would see them. The proposal addresses everything they've asked for, and I've anticipated most of the questions they're likely to raise. Now it's just a matter of presenting it clearly and letting them decide if they want to work with someone who can deliver the results they need. The confidence in my voice reflected not just professional preparation but emotional preparation that came from finally operating with full family support and understanding. The isolation I'd maintained for years had required enormous energy to sustain, and releasing it had freed up mental and emotional resources that I could now direct towards serving clients and growing my business in ways that felt both ambitious and sustainable. Emma's response carried enthusiasm that still surprised me sometimes, genuine excitement about professional opportunities that had nothing to do with her own career advancement but everything to do with celebrating family success. That she finally understood and appreciated. "I have complete faith in your abilities, Maya," she said. "You've built something remarkable, and this company would be lucky to work with you. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you for creating opportunities that didn't exist before you imagined them." The support meant more than she probably realized, validating years of strategic thinking and calculated risk-taking that had felt lonely and uncertain even when they were generating positive results. family celebration of professional achievements. Created different emotional satisfaction than client appreciation or industry recognition, acknowledging not just business success but personal growth and courage that had made the success possible. As I hung up the phone and returned to preparing for the presentation that could transform my agency from successful freelance practice to recognized industry leader, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since David's innocent question about a yellow Lamborghini had forced everyone to confront assumptions that had shaped family relationships for years. The business success was meaningful, but the family transformation felt more significant, representing the kind of authentic connections that money couldn't buy but that made financial achievement feel worthwhile and sustainable. I'd learned that hiding success from people you love doesn't protect anyone, it just creates barriers that prevent genuine support and celebration from flowing in both directions. The yellow Lamborghini was still parked in my garage, beautiful and powerful and ready for weekend drives through Arizona mountains that stretched toward horizons that seemed more possible than ever before. But the real treasure was sitting around family dinner tables where conversations included genuine curiosity about my work, strategic input that improved my business decisions, and celebration of achievements that felt meaningful because they were shared with people who finally understood what they represented. The revelation that had begun with a simple question about a supercar had evolved into family relationships built on mutual respect, authentic communication, and recognition that success could take many different forms as long as it was pursued with integrity and supported with love. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the courage to stop hiding who you've become while everyone was busy worrying about who they thought you were. 1 year later, I stood on the stage of the Phoenix Convention Center addressing 3,000 marketing professionals at the Southwest Digital Summit, sharing strategies that had generated over $200 million in revenue for my clients across 12 different industries. The yellow Lamborghini was parked in the VIP section of the parking garage, but today it felt less like a symbol of hidden success and more like a tool that perfectly matched the life I'd built through years of strategic thinking and disciplined execution. The audience hung on every word as I explained how understanding human psychology could transform struggling businesses into industry leaders, and in the front row sat my entire family, beaming with pride that felt completely different from the worried affection they'd shown me for most of my adult life. Emma had flown in from Denver where she'd relocated after David's firm expanded into Colorado renewable energy projects, bringing her hospital administration expertise to healthcare facilities that were incorporating sustainable technologies into their operations. She'd started her own consulting practice 6 months ago, inspired by watching me build something from nothing and realizing that entrepreneurship wasn't limited to people with technical backgrounds or unconventional risk tolerances. Her business was already profitable, serving healthcare organizations that needed strategic guidance during digital transformations, and she'd become one of my most valuable collaborators on projects that required understanding of both marketing psychology and operational logistics. Carmen had brought her twins to hear their aunt speak, 12-year-old Maria and Antonio, who now understood that creativity and business success weren't mutually exclusive concepts. They'd been fascinated by stories about how writing could generate millions in sales, asking questions about consumer behavior and persuasion techniques that revealed intellectual curiosity about fields they'd never known existed. Carmen herself had parlayed her nursing expertise into a consulting role with medical device companies, helping them understand how their products actually functioned in clinical environments and what messaging would resonate with healthcare professionals who made purchasing decisions. My parents sat in the second row, Dad wearing the same uncomfortable expression he brought to formal events but Mom glowing with the kind of maternal pride that came from finally understanding what her daughter had accomplished during all those years when she'd worried about groceries and health insurance. They'd become unofficial ambassadors for my business within their social circles, connecting me with small business owners who needed marketing assistance and sharing success stories. That demonstrated what was possible when someone combined creative thinking with business acumen. Uncle Miguel had positioned himself strategically near the recording equipment, planning to capture key insights for the digital marketing campaign we'd launched for his auto repair shops. The campaign had increased his revenue by 400% in 8 months, transforming him from someone who offered me job opportunities to someone who sought my professional advice and referred other business owners who needed similar strategic guidance. He'd become one of my most enthusiastic supporters, proof that family relationships could evolve when they were based on mutual respect rather than assumptions about who needed help and who was qualified to provide it. The presentation I was delivering represented everything I'd learned about building authentic success in industries that didn't exist when my parents were establishing their careers. The audience included corporate executives who managed marketing budgets in the millions, entrepreneurs who were scaling startups into major market players, and creative professionals who were trying to figure out how to monetize skills that traditional career paths didn't accommodate. My story resonated with all of them because it demonstrated that success could be achieved outside conventional frameworks as long as you were willing to develop expertise that provided genuine value to people who needed specific problems solved. The speech concluded with a standing ovation that lasted longer than any applause I'd ever received, but the moment that meant the most came afterward when my family rushed the stage with congratulations that felt completely authentic and enthusiastic. Emma hugged me with tears in her eyes, apologizing again for years of concern that had felt like criticism and thanking me for teaching her that unconventional paths could lead to extraordinary destinations. Carmen took pictures of her kids with their successful aunt, explaining to them that Maya had proven you could build wealth by helping other people achieve their goals. Dad shook my hand with the formal gravity he reserved for acknowledging significant achievements, telling me that he was proud of what I'd built and grateful that I'd finally trusted the family enough to share it with them. Mom just held me for a long moment, whispering that she was sorry for worrying so much and that she finally understood why I'd chosen the path that had seemed so risky and uncertain from the outside. Uncle Miguel was already making plans for the networking reception, eager to introduce me to business contacts who could benefit from my expertise. The reception that followed felt like a celebration of more than just professional recognition. It felt like the culmination of a journey that had transformed not just my career but my understanding of what family support could look like when it was based on genuine appreciation rather than protective concern. I moved through conversations with industry leaders who sought my insights on scaling digital marketing operations, but the interactions that felt most meaningful were with family members who could finally participate authentically in discussions about my work because they understood what I was trying to accomplish and why it mattered. David had driven down from Denver specifically for the speech, bringing architectural perspectives that had proven valuable for several client projects, where physical space and digital experience needed to work together seamlessly. His innocent question about the Lamborghini had become family legend, the moment when careful facades had crumbled and authentic relationships had become possible. He'd started referring clients who needed marketing assistance, and his firm had hired me to develop strategies for attracting sustainable construction projects that aligned with their environmental values. Gabriella approached me during the reception with genuine admiration that replaced years of competitive family dynamics, congratulating me on achievements that she now recognized as legitimate expertise rather than lucky breaks or mysterious windfalls. She'd started asking for advice about marketing her legal services, recognizing that her paralegal background and my understanding of consumer psychology could create strategies that would help her advance within her firm while building a personal brand that might eventually support independent practice. The evening felt like a validation of every risk I'd taken and every doubt I'd pushed through during the years when building my business felt lonely and uncertain. But more importantly, it felt like proof that hiding success from people you love doesn't protect anyone, it just prevents the kind of authentic celebration and mutual support that makes achievements feel truly meaningful. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the family pride was transformative, creating emotional satisfaction that no amount of client appreciation or industry awards could replicate. As the reception wound down and family members prepared to return to their hotels or drive home to their own lives, I realized that the yellow Lamborghini parked outside represented something different than it had when I'd first purchased it 18 months ago. It was no longer a secret symbol of success that I hid from people who couldn't understand what it represented. It had become simply a beautiful car that I enjoyed driving, purchased with money I'd earned through work that challenged and fulfilled me, shared with people who finally understood and celebrated what I'd accomplished. The transformation wasn't just about family relationships. It was about understanding that authentic success required authentic relationships, connections based on current reality rather than outdated assumptions or protective facades. I'd spent years thinking that independence meant isolation, that professional achievement required personal sacrifice, that building something meaningful meant choosing between career fulfillment and family connection. The revelation that had begun with David's innocent question had taught me that the most sustainable success included rather than excluded the people who mattered most. Emma stayed after everyone else had left, helping me pack up materials and process the evening's conversations while we waited for the parking garage to clear. The sister who had once worried about my financial stability was now asking sophisticated questions about scaling service businesses and managing client relationships during rapid growth phases. Her transformation from concerned older sibling to strategic collaborator felt like a gift that kept revealing new dimensions of possibility for both personal and professional development. "Maya, I need to tell you something," she said as we walked toward our cars, her voice carrying the serious tone she used for important family conversations. Watching you build your business over the past year, and especially seeing you speak tonight, has completely changed how I think about career development and what's possible when someone is willing to trust their vision enough to pursue it despite other people's doubts. The admission represented everything I'd hoped might happen when family relationships evolved beyond protective concern toward genuine respect and collaboration. Emma had always been successful within conventional frameworks, but seeing alternative approaches to building wealth and professional recognition had expanded her understanding of what achievement could look like and how she might apply creative thinking to her own career challenges. You've always been successful, I said, wanting to acknowledge her achievements while also recognizing the broader implications of what she was sharing. What's changed is your willingness to consider that there might be multiple paths to building something meaningful, and your courage to experiment with approaches that don't follow traditional templates. Her consulting practice had grown rapidly because it combined her healthcare expertise with entrepreneurial thinking that she'd developed by observing my business development strategies. She was applying marketing psychology to client acquisition, using conversion optimization techniques to improve her proposal acceptance rates, and implementing systems thinking that she'd learned from watching me scale operations efficiently. The collaboration between sisters had become mutually beneficial, sharing different types of expertise that enhanced both our professional capabilities. I wanted to apologize again for all those years when I tried to steer you toward more conventional career choices, she continued. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment or financial instability, but I was really just protecting myself from having to question assumptions about how success was supposed to unfold. You were braver than I was, and you achieved things I didn't think were possible. The apology felt significant not just because of what it acknowledged about past family dynamics, but because of what it suggested about future possibilities. For supporting each other's continued growth and development. Emma was no longer the sister who offered career guidance to someone she perceived as struggling, she was a peer who recognized different types of expertise and was willing to learn from approaches that had proven successful even when they didn't match her own experience. We reached our cars in the now empty parking garage, the yellow Lamborghini gleaming under the fluorescent lights next to Emma's practical sedan that reflected her preference for reliable transportation over flashy displays of wealth. Both vehicles served their owners' needs perfectly, representing different approaches to balancing function and enjoyment, responsibility and pleasure, practical considerations and emotional satisfaction. Drive safely, Emma said, hugging me one more time before getting into her car. And Maya? Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is trust yourself enough to pursue something that doesn't make sense to other people. The insight represented everything our family had learned about supporting each other's growth rather than trying to control each other's choices based on fear or limited understanding. Emma was returning to Denver with expanded perspective on entrepreneurship and business development that would influence her own strategic thinking. I was driving home with renewed appreciation for family relationships that had evolved beyond protective concern toward genuine collaboration and mutual respect. The drive home through Phoenix at midnight felt like a meditation on how completely life could transform when you stopped managing other people's perceptions and started living authentically. The city lights stretched toward mountains that had become symbols of possibility rather than barriers, reminding me that horizons were meant to be reached rather than admired from a distance. My business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first started writing marketing copy in that tiny Tempe apartment, but the professional success felt less significant than the personal growth that had made it sustainable and meaningful. My phone buzzed with text messages from audience members who wanted to connect about potential collaborations, industry publications that wanted to feature my strategies in upcoming articles, and conference organizers who were inviting me to speak at events across the country. The professional opportunities were exciting, but the messages that meant the most came from family members who were sharing their pride and gratitude for an evening that had allowed them to finally understand and celebrate what I'd been building during all those years when they'd worried about my choices. The yellow Lamborghini handled perfectly as I navigated through empty streets toward the apartment that had become headquarters for a business that employed 12 people and served clients on 3 continents. The car no longer felt like compensation for family relationships that didn't provide the recognition I craved. It felt like a tool that perfectly matched the lifestyle I'd created through strategic thinking and disciplined execution. Sometimes, the most powerful symbols are the ones that stop feeling symbolic and start feeling simply appropriate. Arriving home to the apartment that had witnessed every phase of my business development felt like completing a circle that connected past struggles with present success, early uncertainty with current confidence, isolated independence with supported authenticity. The space looked the same as it had when I'd first moved in, but everything was different because the relationships that gave meaning to achievement had evolved beyond recognition. I parked the Lamborghini in its designated space and walked through the courtyard where desert plants thrived in conditions that would challenge vegetation from more forgiving climates. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Some of the most beautiful growth happened in environments that initially seemed hostile or unsupportive, as long as you developed the right strategies for extracting what you needed from available resources while staying true to your essential nature. The apartment felt quiet and peaceful, a sanctuary that had supported years of creative work and strategic thinking that had generated value for hundreds of businesses while building wealth that exceeded anything my family had thought possible when they were worrying about my unconventional career choices. The space held memories of late nights spent learning about consumer psychology, early mornings developing campaign strategies, and countless client calls that had resulted in revenue generation that seemed almost magical to people who didn't understand the systematic thinking behind the results. As I prepared for sleep after a day that felt like a culmination of everything I'd been working toward, I reflected on how completely my understanding of success had evolved since that evening, when David's innocent question about a yellow Lamborghini had forced everyone to confront assumptions that had shaped family relationships for years. The professional achievements were meaningful, but the family transformation felt more significant, representing the kind of authentic connections that made wealth feel worthwhile rather than isolating. The business would continue growing because it was built on expertise that provided genuine value to clients who needed specific problems solved. The family relationships would continue deepening because they were now based on mutual respect rather than protective concern or defensive independence. The Lamborghini would continue being an excellent car that I enjoyed driving, purchased with money earned through work that challenged and fulfilled me, shared with people who finally understood what it represented. The revelation that had begun with a simple question about a supercar had evolved into a complete transformation of how success could be achieved and shared, how families could support each other's growth, and how authenticity could replace performance in relationships that mattered most. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the courage to stop hiding who you've become while everyone was busy assuming they knew who you were supposed to be. The yellow Lamborghini was just a car, but it had become the catalyst for family relationships built on genuine understanding rather than careful avoidance of difficult conversations. That transformation was worth more than any vehicle, any business contract, or any professional recognition, because it created the foundation for sharing success in ways that multiplied rather than diminished its meaning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.